Hi there, and welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In this week's episode, I welcome Zane Landin from his home in California. Zane is a mental health and disability advocate, queer rights advocate, entrepreneur, and positive change maker. Zane identifies as Hispanic, queer, and disabled. He's very open about his identities and experience with suicide, grief after losing his mother, and overcoming his fear of rejection. He is also the founder of Positive Vibes magazine, a digital magazine dedicated to telling authentic stories about mental health, wellness, and inspiration. Zane is a passionate storyteller who regularly writes about wellness, psychology, and culture. His work has been featured in Forbes, New York Weekly, and many more. He is also the founder and president of Landin Dreams PR, a consulting business working with media and mental health advocates. This episode discusses Zane's childhood struggles, his disability, how he overcame, lessons learned, and so much more. It has been a pleasure to have Zane join me, and I know my listeners, you will enjoy this episode. Thank you so much to my listeners for joining me on this journey. Comment on the posts on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and let me know what you think of this episode. Also, head to Amazon.com or takealot.com and get your copy of my book, Ray of Light, and please leave me a rating and review. It would mean the world to me. Also, please check out my website and download your free journal prompt and relaxing meditation if you've not yet done so on the resources page. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Hi, Zane. Welcome to Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope. How are you?
I'm doing well tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Zane, you've just graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Communication and Public Relations from Cal Poly Pomona University. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Well, congratulations. Congratulations, man.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful achievement.
Yeah, no, I've been at Cal Poly for a while. I was there for 6 years, so I was in university for a while, and I think it's okay for people to take the time and patience to really determine their direction and their purpose, because I think that's one of the hardest things, and sometimes not always tied to a major either. But I think there's a lot of interesting messaging that happens in university where they kind of press you to finish on a certain time. So I was happy that it took me some time, but I'm glad I'm going in this direction now.
Good. Yeah. And, I love that you can speak about it so openly, because I think many times, when people take time to complete a university degree, sometimes they feel that shame emotion and they don't really speak about it. So I love that you're bringing this to the fore and you having this conversation. And I think, sometimes it's difficult in families too, when they don't know how to deal with disabilities. Did you experience that with your family?
I mean, I did. I was a first generation student, which the definition that applies to me is first generation means both of your parents did not graduate with a bachelor's degree. So people in my family did get their bachelor's, but my direct parents did not. I believe my great aunt, or my aunt, I never knew her, in the 60s graduated from UCLA and wrote a book on philosophy. But because my parents did not graduate with their bachelor's, my mom did receive her associates, but because I'm a first generation student. And of course, yes, being a first generation student does create some barriers where my family didn't understand the entire scope of being a university student. So sometimes they didn't understand how hard it could be. They didn't understand the culture of it and kind of where do I go if I need to navigate something, where exactly am I supposed to go to? When I see students that have parents that have their masters or even PhDs, I'm like, that's amazing. I really do wish I had that support where my parents really kind of knew what I was going through, because I think there is a process that university students go through, especially mental health process. A lot of people can claim that they've never experienced mental health, but I think every college student does, because university is sometimes unnecessarily too demanding on students, what they're expecting to do when some of them work full time or have kids or have to take care of a million other things. And on top of that, they have to do several things for university. And university, is hard. But I think that, I wish we would introduce more flexibility, more understanding, more of an inclusive based approach to the classroom setting. So, a lot of different things like that. So, but I am very open about it. And I think the pressures that students face that have certain underrepresented identities, like being first generation or low income, whatever it is, There's definitely like an external pressure, of course, that they need to have everything together. That's a greater conversation about kind of societal expectations. But I think also a lot of that is internal because they feel out of place in university. They think that they have to prove something,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it's sad they have to do that because then they have to always be doing something, always be super involved, always be taking 8 or 9 classes or 6 or 7 classes, whatever it is. I know a lot of first generation students that kind of have to overcompensate, and not necessarily because they have to finish on time or finish early, but because they sometimes think they have to prove so they could kind of submerge in the culture rather than just kind of embracing their lived experience of being a first generation student. They think they kind of have to kind of blend in with every other student. So I'm happy that my university, Cal Poly Pomona, is actually more than half is first generation students. So actually a huge component of that university does have this great population of first generation students. So a lot of people do tell their stories and are very capable and own that capability and don't think they have to prove anything. But again, this stuff is a process and people do are going to experience this. And a lot of times they call it imposter syndrome, but it is a process a lot of students go through.
Yeah, and I can identify that because I think for many people that
Mm-hmm.
is the reality in many different countries. And yeah, I know I applaud
Mm-hmm.
you. And once again, congratulations. Well done. So we're gonna just dive straight in. You know, in
Thank you.
life, we sometimes have all of these different experiences, right? Because that's how we live life. And some people are born into their circumstances right off the bat. It starts for them as babies, and for others, it starts in their childhood. For others, it starts in their adulthood. And so all of these experiences, that is how we live life, because that's what shapes us. That's what brings us to the point in our life where we are. Every year that goes
Mm-hmm.
by is a different experience that helps us
Mm-hmm.
to grow, that helps us to expand, that helps us to become, that helps us to connect. And
Yeah.
if we look at it, it's a beautiful experience, but it's not always an easy experience. Sometimes it comes with many different challenges. So you've accomplished so much in a very short space of time. Do you want to take us through what your journey was like through childhood and what led you to this point after graduating
Wow.
university?
Well, I will say, I think what the first thing that I think is important that you said was all of our experiences kind of make up who we are and kind of our identity. I think that includes our identities, but I think people have to also pay attention to the choices they make because I think each choice definitely shapes our individual identity. If you think about it, we should really appreciate the choices we made. Sometimes we make choices that maybe you take a job offer or you're with someone and it doesn't work out or something doesn't go right. I'm not saying you blame yourself for making that choice, but understand that that choice made you who you are. And I think that when you look at the like infinite amount of possibilities that there are, the choices we make and the ones we don't are going to change who we are. So you could have totally chosen a different route and you would be a different person. That's how I see it. That's how powerful I think choices are, and kind of go into like a butterfly effect kind of a way. But what I will say about your question is it's hard to start from the beginning, but when I was a kid, I was very boyish. I was very happy. I tried my best to be very kind. My mom taught me a lot about being kind and always not being shy either, because I wasn't a really shy kid, but I was shy throughout different times of my life. I think sometimes people look at the like shyness phenomenon and think, oh, they're a child, they'll go out of it. You can kind of go in and out of it. That's like with everything. So sometimes even throughout the pandemic, I before I was an extrovert, and then kind of during the pandemic, I felt really closed and like an introvert. So, and there's always changes to personalities and behaviors, and it may not seem like so, but it's okay if they do change. And so, there's a lot of fluidity in that stuff. But from a very young age, from the time I can remember, I definitely experienced mental health symptoms that would later become, actual mental health conditions. And I always felt out of place. I never really fit in with any group. I always felt kind of isolated. And part of that was my identities, who I was, and also, mental health, because I had, sometimes I had uncontrollable anger, a lot of self esteem issues. I had problems socializing with people. So, a lot of this is very difficult. And then when you are that way and you already feel isolated and you still don't fit in, you become even more isolated because you directly feel isolated from a group of people and you might actually be isolated from them. And now that it's in your head that you are different, you isolate yourself even more, right? To the point where you are alone. So there were times where I was alone. And I know that a lot of times, especially with the mental health conversation, people say you're not alone. Sometimes you are, though, and sometimes you really are alone. And maybe there are people experiencing what you are, but in that moment, you are alone, though. And even if there
Right.
are millions of people out there that share your lived experience, not the same, but very, very closely related, I still think you are alone to a certain extent. In that capacity, in that environment, in that place where you were, I think you were kind of alone. So I don't downplay that people are alone too. I think that we need to, I don't think that is the only thing that's going to change anything. Because a lot of times when it comes to mental health, I see people saying, you are not alone. I think it's a powerful message, but I think you also understand that there are a lot of people that are alone and they may not have anyone or any support to get them through their mental health journey or whatever it is. So we have to be very careful with the words we use. Again, while it's a good message, I think we also have to be mindful of the other people and where they are in life. Anyways, I will say I'm lucky that my family was very well aware of mental health, of what it was and how it impacted people. Not that they're therapists, psychologists, they're not, they're nothing like that. They're just people who knew
Mm-hmm.
about mental health because of their family. And this is why I'm always urging, parents and families to learn as much as they can about mental health, because a lot of times your kids might be experiencing it, and maybe it's not a diagnosable mental health condition, but it is a very substantial decline in their mental health, or they're really depressed, they're incredibly stressed out about school or university, or they just broke up with someone, whatever it is. A lot of this stuff is going to impact how they feel about themselves and their self-esteem. And so again, all that goes back to mental health. And so that's why we'll tell parents is make sure that you kind of know about it. And even if it's not exactly the culture or, the religious ideals, I still think you should be very open to it, because it's not going to help your child if they're having to avoid these aspects about themselves.
Mm-hmm. So did your parents get involved and they noticed this decline in your mental health, and what did they do?
Yeah, they were very aware of it. They noticed, and I can't even remember. I believe I was probably like in second or first grade. So very young. I don't remember how old I was, like 8 or 9. And I was already put on a 504 plan. I was already seeing, I wasn't necessarily seeing an outside psychologist, but there was an inside psychologist at my school system that I saw once a week to kind of actually communicate.
Mm-hmm. So can you just tell us what is a 504 plan?
Oh yes, of course. 504 plan is basically a supportive learning pathway for students who learn differently, or students who are neurodiverse, or students with mental health, or students with disabilities, whatever label people want to use. It is all under that branch of a 504 plan, kind of like an IEP, individualized education plan.
Right.
I think it's kind of derogatory, but if you think of the term special ed, that's kind of what it was. I don't like that term. I don't know if they call it that anymore as much. Every school is different, but we're moving more towards more inclusive language. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of times for people with disability, students with disabilities,
Right.
who just need that additional support. And as someone who doesn't just advocate for mental health, I advocate for disability, and that people deserve their accommodations. And again, there's a huge misbelief in accommodations, that accommodations are just a handout, that they're just getting this free support because they don't want to do the work, and they're getting more additional support than their peers, and that's not fair for their peers. It's also not fair that they have this condition that they can't control. So we have to look at it that way, because I've known people that have been embarrassed, that have been shamed publicly about having a disability because they're receiving a free handout, and those are air quotes if for the audio,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think it's very fair. And again, I think, like, imagine, like,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
like, you have something you can't control and you're like kind of being blamed for it. It's very traumatic. And you just question, why am I being targeted? Why am I experiencing this? Like, I have no control in how I was born, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And was that your experience at the school where you were on the 504 plan?
luckily for me, no. But like I said, I did know people, not at that school, but other schools that experienced that. So again, I'm very fortunate, because a lot of schools, and I actually, I've worked with parents to help them kind of come up with a plan to not just get accommodations, but how to actually communicate that. Because I knew parents that their kids were on a 504 plan, but they were not receiving accommodations like they really needed to. So I kind of have to get real with parents and just say, you have to kind of be assertive. That this is your child's livelihood. And if they're not doing well in school, they may feel a certain way about themselves, and then it impacts their mental health, and they feel worse about themselves. So you have to be very careful.
So where do you interact with parents in this way while you were at school?
No, more like now. So while I was in school, I was not definitely advocating for disability. That came a lot long later. I think because, like, again, I say that like I'm very much a storyteller. I'm always very vulnerable about my experience, and I talk about disability, and I talk about the organizations I'm part of that support these initiatives and these communities. So there are parents I know that have just kind of reached out to me and asked, "What do I do in this situation?" And again, I tell them I'm not an expert,
I
but
see.
this is what I would do as a parent. And this is what I think you need to do. And again,
Okay.
every child situation
Mm-hmm.
is different. I'm not going to insert myself and tell you what exactly needs to be done, but I think that you might need to take these steps in order for your child to be accommodated, for them to actually be at an equal playing field with other peers. And it's not fair that they're not getting those equal treatments. You know what I mean?
Okay, so you then went through the 504 plan, you completed that plan and graduated high school, went on to university. What were some of the other challenges that you faced?
Yes, aside from being neurodiverse, having a hard time with school and concentrating and classwork, I also, again, I mentioned the mental health symptoms I had. So I saw a professional psychologist from middle school to the end of high school. So almost 7 years on top of the school psychologist I was seeing. But at the time when I was in middle school, I really wasn't on a 504 plan anymore. I think I was given a lot of resources and support to support myself in middle school.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think I really needed that support in elementary school, but come middle school and high school, I think I really found a regimen that really helped me, and I was able to kind of sustain myself in the educational system. But it was definitely not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It was still definitely difficult
Yeah.
because schoolwork is hard, especially when it comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are times where I was struggling, and I definitely was depressed, and had these mental health thoughts. And again, it impacts how you
Mm-hmm.
feel about yourself and everyone, and it impacted my confidence and self-esteem. So, going to a professional psychologist definitely helped. And again, I'm fortunate my family was diligent in finding me one. And there were people they knew that saw this certain psychologist, and, they referred me. And so for the longest time, I saw the same psychologist for 7 years, and we got to know each other a lot. And I was able to share things I wouldn't normally about how I was feeling in my emotions. And she taught me strategies on how to cope with them and how to manage my stress and manage my emotions, things that were not normally taught. And I think we need to be taught better how to manage our emotions, especially with people with mental health conditions who it can feel uncontrollable, and at times it is. But what are the tools and support you need? Especially, I think, again, the whole goes back to you might feel alone. And again, if you have bipolar or depression, you may have an anxiety attack. People around may not even know how to react to that. So this is also the importance of shifting the culture of mental health and trauma, so people know what to do when these situations happen. I think it's such an important thing, like even teaching kids about how to manage their mental health and just knowing the signs of suicide. I
Yeah.
do not remember learning
Yeah.
anything like that in school. Not really.
But this was also something that you faced. You also had experience with suicide.
Yeah, and
And were you in therapy at the time when this was your experience?
what's interesting is, and I know we mentioned before this, that I always had a fear of rejection. And sometimes when I was rejected, I would get suicidal. Sometimes it was that, I would say, kind of irrational, because, my fear of rejection was so strong that I really took it as something completely personal. So when I wouldn't get something, or I was denied or rejected something, I took it so personal, and I thought it was directly about my character and who I am and what I
Mm.
bring to this world. And it may not, they may be completely separate. There may not be anything about that. So I really had to learn how to take myself away from that and just look at it as, come back, look at it objectively, and say, this opportunity may not be for me. I can try it a different time. Maybe it's a blessing in disguise. A lot of different things that I've
Yeah.
learned to cope with that failure, or that feeling of failure, or that rejection or redirection, whatever people want to say. But so, yeah, there were times I actually had suicidal thoughts in high school, but
Yeah.
I never brought them up because they would go away really quick. I think it was, after I graduated, it was university, and I was going through a lot. A lot of personal stuff, a lot of things that are out of my control, a lot of rejection, a lot of different things. I think it was all so much at once that this was when I was definitely feeling overwhelming feelings of suicide almost all the time. It was very frustrating. And they felt so intrusive, like I couldn't get them out of my head. And I kept thinking there was really something wrong with me, because I've gone through
Mm-hmm.
psychology, gone through this for 7 years. Why am I not?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I? Well, there's no connection here. This time I was seeing a therapist, and the stuff that they taught me, why is it not working right now? So I think something people need to understand about mental health is, it's not a miracle drug. It's not a miracle thing that happens. When someone sees a psychologist, that's a good support that they need, but sometimes they're going to have a relapse, or they're going to have a setback, or that trauma can come out at any point. Just because you're seeing a therapist or psychologist doesn't mean that all their problems are gone.
Yeah.
In my opinion, growth is not linear. We think of growth as linear, but I think growth is someone who's just trying their best. They're trying their best and they're taking the necessary steps to get better. And if they have a setback, that does not mean they're not growing. That experience is making them grow. So it might look like a roller coaster, but can we stop looking at it that way? It's just growth. And that's how I see it, and I don't care if they have a setback or relapse, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That might be that necessary step for them to grow. And I don't want to look at it as a failure or a rejection, because this might be exactly what's intended for them to get better, or maybe the inspiration that they need. So that's one thing I'll say is, again, for one, I don't think growth is linear. And I also don't think that for change to happen, it doesn't always need to be this upward trajectory. You know what I mean? So for someone who is seen a psychologist, don't expect them to just get magically better and keep going up, because that's not how emotions work. And our circumstances are always changing, and that impacts our emotions too, right?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. I think that there are all these different interventions like talk therapy and or psychotherapy that you've described. And, there are these interventions that have a purpose and they do teach us all of these tools. But I think we need to have the awareness to be able to say, okay, I am now in a relapse. I am now starting to feel depressed, because there will always be the signs that lead up to this before it actually happens. And I think we need to create that awareness to say, okay, this is what is happening. And it's so important that we have the vocabulary and be able to identify our emotions, to know exactly what it is, and then to say, okay, I need help. I have to reach out. I have to reach out to someone. Because I think that is part of the tools that we are taught during talk therapy. And I agree with you that, life brings challenges all the time. It's very few people in this life that get away unscathed. But I think that it is all part of that growing. It's a part of growth for us. And it is part of how we evolve and change as human beings. And, if we look even at spirituality on this point, some people might even say that this is preparing for the spiritual world that comes next, because we need to understand the spiritual aspect of ourselves, because we're leaving the physical aspect behind. So this is how we start to prepare for that journey.
Yeah, I also do want to mention that I also don't want to glamorize growth, because I think sometimes I'll see in the media or social media that sometimes growth can look kind of glamorized, where it's like, oh, we're always growing, we're constantly changing, but people have to understand that sometimes that growth is hard, and it's not you just go up and you keep going up, kind of like I said before. And I also want to share that, you know what, I think it's for you to decide. For me, when things happen to me, it's growth for me. But for some, it's not growth. And for some, it doesn't represent growth. And that's okay. I think that's for them to decide. Because for someone who maybe has experienced major, major trauma, like being assaulted as a child or something like that, for them, I would never say that's growth. For them, that's for them to decide if it's growth for them. Because for me, I'm not going to say anything. I think for the person, it's empowering for them to decide what their growth is. Because for some, they don't need the growth, and for some, they don't need to be a strong person. Because I see posts that will kind of share the sentiment of, even though you went through all this, you're still a stronger person. I can understand that myself, but for some, they don't need to be strong. They don't need to. Why do they have to experience this stuff to be a strong person? So I understand that people are at very different mentalities in life. This is where I am and what my growth looks like, but for someone else, it's not. So I just want to, make it clear, because I see that sometimes there's a little bit of that's how growth is seen, but it can be very, very messy, and it's for the person to decide if it's growth or not.
Yes. Oh, 100%.
You know what I mean?
Definitely. Extreme trauma. It's very difficult to see growth in those initial years after that extreme trauma. So yes, definitely. Right. And again, I think, like you say, it's a subjective issue. You determine it. So I wanted to talk about your project. You had this college project that turned into a magazine called Positive Vibes. I love the name, by the way. Tell us a bit, what inspired you to start this online magazine?
Yeah, let me go back a bit, because it's going to relate to the magazine. I will share that, I said I had some suicidal thoughts in high school. And then when I went through that thing in university, it was probably my third year. That's when I said I was very suicidal. And I was also engaged in self-harm. I was cutting myself. I'm going to be just very open about it, because that's what I went through. I still have the scars. And there are good reminders of not wanting to do that, because I had people personally reach out that they wanted to stop me, or wanted to stop seeing that. And it wasn't a selfish reason. It was because they wanted me to, not do that anymore. I really was having a hard time. I took the semester off. It was even towards the end of it, but I needed to leave university because it was so much stress. And like I said, I felt so scattered, and purposely I had no idea where I was going. And it's interesting because sometimes when you feel purposeless, you can grow from that. But for me, I felt like I was going even further down because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who I was, where I was, what was going on in my life. So many things. And I think that time I really decided to re-envision myself and think about everything I've gone through and see how I could transform myself for the next semester. I think after that is when I decided that even though I have this lived mental health experience that I've been carrying around, it was never that bad. And I think just again because the circumstances just made everything feel so much worse. It really kind of highlighted some of the issues that I was having that I probably didn't address for a while. So I came back and I did better than ever. I knew what I needed to do, which was recognize when I wasn't feeling right. Because a lot of times, unfortunately, people look for help when they're at a crisis. And now I was like, I cannot wait for a crisis. I cannot wait for a crisis to happen. Like you said, if you're already kind of noticing the signs in your life and you're being mindful to them, you'll know when to reach out for help. And that's the best
Yeah.
time you can reach out for help is when you're starting to see the signs. Because if you reach out when you're having a crisis, who knows if they can even see you at that moment? What if they can't see you for a whole week? I mean, we know about university and how like there's not enough counselors. We already know that that's a thing, and sometimes students have to wait weeks to get an appointment. And so if you're having a crisis at that moment and you have to wait
Yeah.
weeks, it can be a huge disaster for someone. So I think that's so important, and why we need to educate people, young people, young adults about mental health so they can understand the signs, take action in their own life so they can seek out help. So that's what I did. I was more communicative about everything. That's when I decided to research organizations. I got involved. My whole life became mental health. Because before, again, it was just the lived experience. But now it was about how can I change the culture? How can I bring about storytelling? How can I help others? How can I join organizations? How can I learn as much as I can about this topic that I really didn't know too much about before? It was just something I experienced. And that whole journey is what kind of brought me to finding the magazine, which it all kind of led to it. You said it was a school project, and it was because in spring of 2020, I was taking copy editing, and our final project, we had to create a publication. And the professor had specific articles that we were supposed to decide if they were good enough for the publication we were making. So I decided to create I decided to create Positive Vibes digital magazine. It's called Positive Vibes Magazine, but it's a digital magazine. I decided to create it because I wanted to create a very uplifting, supportive platform that I thought that people really needed during the pandemic.
Okay.
Because again, we're talking about spring of 2020. That's when the pandemic first hit, right?
Yeah.
And the project was in April.
Right. The mental health of so many started taking a toll at that time.
Yeah, and I think that was a like almost a paradigm shift in a way because the mental health community or the mental health epidemic felt like a issue that was not taken seriously by many people. But mental health was like almost it was like this colossal awakening of people who were experiencing these really horrible times that they probably never experienced mental health to this magnitude before, and it was an interesting time. But that means it was also a great time to talk about
Mhm.
mental health in the media and the news, which we still are not seeing much of. The only time I will ever see about mental health
Yeah.
when it impacts the news, if it's about legislation or about violence. I really never hear about mental health organically. I think I saw something on MSNBC like in May during Mental Health Month, and I think that's a great first step. We can go further. We can go deeper, and also because mental health exists every single day, not just during May. There's so much more that we can do. At the time, I was really frustrated with the media because I heard all about
Hmm.
COVID and the COVID statistics. But I was like, where is everything about mental health though? Like but so many people are experiencing decline in their mental health during these really unprecedented times. Why aren't we hearing about their stories and what they're doing to feel better about themselves? That the tools that people need to hear. So that's kind of what inspired me to take that certain direction. I was like, I want to create Positive Vibes Magazine, a positive platform where we can talk about mental health and trauma or whatever people want to share about on how they're impacted by the pandemic and honestly just everything that has led them to where they are today.
I love how you use storytelling in the magazine to really address something that is such an important issue, like, mental health. In the magazine, when you are telling these stories, you are dealing with real life stories. How do you create that safe space for people to share their journey with you? Because it's a hard thing to get to that vulnerable place and share in a generous way.
That project came about, spurred a real thing. So I decided to actually pursue it. We were going to focus on just writing blog posts until one person reached out about doing an actual interview, and that is really what changed everything. Because again, I wasn't going to focus on people's storytelling. But looking back, it's so important, especially during the pandemic. Because the pandemic, we heard about the science and the stats. What about the people behind the pandemic? The people that have been impacted. So I will share. It took time. It took time for me to, for one, be vulnerable myself. Because I feel like if I'm going to lead the conversation or I'm going to create the safe space, I kind of need to lead by example. And that's scary. I understand why people don't want to be vulnerable, because you never know how people are going to react. And for people who don't want to be vulnerable, maybe they've had terrible experiences where they're vulnerable and they were taken advantage of, or they're manipulated. So I understand people's a wall they build sometimes. Sometimes it's for them to survive, and that's okay. But I encourage people to find that support and to be careful with what you put out there then. I think that we're seeing more of a culture of people being vulnerable, which I do appreciate. So sometimes I will do an interview and they'll be vulnerable right off the bat. I don't really have to say anything. I had an interview where someone explicitly told me the details about their assault. And I think that's incredibly empowering for them to do that. I think that they're a very vulnerable person. We need to just learn how to listen better. I think that's one of the most important things. I think a lot of times people see themselves as fixers and people who are going to give advice, but I think sometimes you just kind of need to listen to someone. That's all they need. If you want to give advice, ask them, can I give you my advice? And if they say yes, then tell them what you think. And if they say no, don't take it personal. Sometimes it's just not what they need. But when I do these interviews, I make sure that, I tell them my intention, like, I want to share your story.
Yeah.
This is about you. You talk about what you want. So if there's nothing you don't want to talk about, you just let me know. No hard feelings. If there's a question I ask that you don't think is appropriate or you don't want to talk about, just tell me and we're good. I ask them if they have any questions. I share a little bit about my story and even the intention of the magazine. So I think that me being able to open up to them creates that safe space. How I create a safe space is you make sure that you share your intentions with the room. Those intentions. Make sure people are clear. This place is a safe space. This space is yours alone, making sure that people feel safe. And again, you want that physical safety, of course, but I think you want that psychological safety, kind of like that emotional sanctuary that they're looking for, where they can actually be themselves. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. It makes perfect sense to me. And I like the way you say that it becomes a sanctuary for someone to come in and be themselves. And I think sometimes people just want to be heard. So even if you don't have the answer, just coming alongside them and listening is enough. I want to talk about the Mental Health Youth Action Forum. So you met President Biden and so many other celebrities and dignitaries. I mean, that must have been so exciting. Tell us what that experience was like for you.
Oh my goodness. I mean, as I mentioned, I got involved in a lot of mental health organizations, one being Active Minds. They were the ones working with Mental Health Youth Action Forum. I discovered it in like November of last year. When I first saw it, I was just in awe. I was like, unbelievable. I was like, it really does sound like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it was. MTV was hosting it. And I love that media. Again, my whole thing is about media and mental health, because I think that the storytelling is so important. If we're really going to move mountains naturally, people just share their story. And that is what's going to break those barriers, right? I mean, that's how I think you're going to see it naturally. I think storytelling is the most important aspect to advocacy, because it's like the natural way of kind of shifting perspectives. That's how I see it. Anyways, so the forum was about that too. It was about storytelling. The forum was working with like 19 nonprofits, including JED Foundation, Active Minds, Born This Way Foundation, some of the biggest mental health organizations you hear about. And then the last aspect was that it's at the White House. So I was like, there's so many components moving here, and it just showed how important this was and how exciting it was. I've never seen anything like this at this magnitude for mental health, especially youth mental health. Because again, this was addressing youth mental health and the intersections of it. a lot of the people chosen were youth advocates to actually speak and share our perspective on mental health rather than people who don't belong to our generation kind of speaking on behalf of us. We actually get to share our personal stories and we get to have confidence doing it. And we received that space to do so. So yeah, I applied and luckily I was accepted. I can't even tell you how I felt when I was first accepted. The feeling was just complete surrealness, like it was a dream. After we were accepted, like through March to May, we did like these every other week online sessions where we got to know people. So we got to know each other, we got to know the organizations, we got to know White House staff, MTV staff before we were even there. The whole forum was amazing. There was just activities, practicing our pitches that we were working on, and then there was this Pinterest dinner that, of course, Pinterest hosted at like the Smithsonian. Then Wednesday was the actual forum at the White House. It was just a great opportunity, and it was broadcasted along many channels. Some people recognized me. It was just this opportunity to be a part of a piece of something so much bigger than I think a lot of people are seeing. Even though the forum was a long time ago, I mean like a couple months ago in May, I'm still connected with the people. I still have these great connections. And so I loved it so much. And it was such a great experience. And President Biden, I don't think was supposed to show up. After the event, we were kind of waiting. He like kind of visited us. Like he just kind of snuck in. We didn't even realize he was there. Beautiful moment. Standing like 2 or 3 feet away from, 2 or 3 feet is probably a little much, but I was probably like 8 feet away from him, but I was very close. Like I was like 2 people away. And so wonderful opportunity to hear the president up close talk about his life. He talked about the country's progress and everything. And he had a good presence.
What an incredible experience. I'm so thrilled that you got to have it and that you are building all of these wonderful, amazing connections through all of these organizations that you are involved in. So Zane, what would you say is one of your biggest life lessons?
Try and live in the moment, the present moment. I hear that a lot. Like I hear a lot of people say we need to live in the present moment. But why though? I think the reason why we say that is for one to be grateful in that moment you're in. I'm talking about the good, positive ones, maybe not the negative ones. But those moments that are timeless, like I would say hold on to those because they go by way too quickly. And so that's why I tell people to live in the moment. And I didn't really get to share, but as you know, my mom passed away last year. And so that was something traumatic.
My condolences, Zane.
No, yeah, thank you. And it was something I will say is traumatic, losing a very close, personal, loved one like that when they were kind of your everything. And it feels like you're really missing a piece of the puzzle of yourself and you don't really feel complete. And it's okay. I think that's how you're going to feel. And that's how you're going to feel forever. It doesn't mean that you can't succeed. It doesn't mean you can't be happy. And it doesn't mean that you won't feel sad or feel angry. I think you should feel those things because they're completely natural. But that's one thing I've learned through the forum, but also with my mom was, well, just try your best to live in the moment because time goes so quickly. And then sometimes your loved one passes away. That's why even when you see people who are reflecting on their life in their 80s or 90s, they say, where's the time gone? And it's people who maybe in their 20s or 30s, they're not thinking that way. But I think you have to really hold on to those moments because they can go away at any moment. And it's sad. But those are the memories you want to cherish.
Just in closing, Zane, I'm going to link all of your links for social media in the show notes. Do you have any last words of inspiration for our listeners?
I think you don't have to have everything together. I think that's the main thing that the theme that I've been kind of talking about. The very beginning with, you graduated university in 6 years, or it took you 15 years to actually figure out what your real career is, or it took you years to patch things up with someone, whatever it is, it's okay to not have everything together. No one does. I think the most important thing to share is nobody has everything together, but there are people that do a great job at convincing you that they have everything together. But just know that a lot of people don't have everything together. And honestly, depending on what your capabilities are, sometimes share that with people. Share your story and share with others that I don't have everything together and I need support. I don't think you'll have any idea what, a magnet effect will happen, and people are going to resonate with that because, trust me, as we just said, nobody has it together. So if you can share that and you're open about it, I think a lot of people will resonate with you and be inspired by that, and maybe even come to support you if you need it, whatever it is. So that's my final words.
Thank you. And I think it comes back again to connection, It's about bridging that gap between the feeling that you described as that loneliness and being alone, right? And because if we are sharing, we are connecting. That's a really great message. Thank you. Zane, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you join me today. And thank you for the work that you do in this world. Thank you for positively representing and presenting mental health stories in this world. Thank you for being an advocate for mental health. Thank you for helping destigmatize the issue around mental health. And I think it's an important issue that deserves the spotlight. And thank you for encouraging people to have those difficult conversations, but also for normalizing it.
Thank you so much again for having me. It was great.
That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following My Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode. Same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light.